Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Today's going to be a really fun and exciting session because we have some experts here that are going to help us talk about why wireless microphones might drop out. But before we get into that, just a few items of housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, just like all of our other webinars, and will be available in about a week or so for on-demand viewing. When it is available, you will be able to find it at shure.com/webinars. Once again, that is shure.com/webinars. And that is a great site to go through for all sorts of webinars across all sorts of audio topics. Our archives are there, and you can also see which webinars are coming up. So once again, that's shure.com/webinars. Another note about the recording, I will send out an email to everyone who's registered once that recording is available with a direct link as well. So you don't have to keep watching the webinars page. You can just wait for that email. And then you'll be able to get directly to the archived version. Second of all, and most importantly, as we go through the session today, we encourage you to ask as many questions as you have. Just look for the Q&A section. You might need to click on a question mark in a circle or, expand your toolbar and find it, but find that Q&A section and type in all of your wireless questions because that is what we are here to do today. And speaking of what we are here to do today, let's take a look at that agenda on the next slide. All right, so we're in section 1 and we're almost done with it with the welcome and introduction. Then these gentlemen are going to go through some sort of initial wireless setup tips, and then we'll dive into the questions. All right, and then let's take a look at who these wonderful gentlemen are today. We have 3 amazing applications engineers from Shure across the world. So we've got a global representation today with my friends Dave, Nihao, and Falk, and I'm gonna kick it over to them to introduce themselves individually.
Thanks, Cheryl. I guess I'll kick it off here. My name's Dave Mendez. I'm an applications engineer in the US, really for the UCANS area, so US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I've been at Shure quite a while, about 18 years at this point, and that slightly blurry photo is of me when the original Axient analog system debuted. It was a very fun trip. We got there were a couple debut events, but this was one of the ones that was pretty high profile at 2012 Fiesta Bowl, and then the following day was a New Year's Day or January 2nd final NFL game of the season, and kind of put it through its paces. And very interesting environment. So much RF going on that you don't actually have that much space, so you're basically given some frequencies, and it was a good test of what that flagship could do, which was avoid interference. It was a very fun trip. But here, I'll pass it along to our next panelist.
Hi all, my name is Nihao. I am an applications engineer in Japan. Although I don't look very Japanese, I originally come from Poland. So I worked for Shure for 5 years almost already. And before that, I was working in Europe, in Poland, for Polish Shure distributor, as well as I was doing many various RF freelancing jobs. And yeah, this picture you can see right now is from one of the major Japanese music festivals, Fuji Rock Festival. This is our little RF booth where we controlled all the frequencies and helped coordinate for all the artists and headliners that came throughout the course of 3 days of the Fuji Rock Festival. And I'm very happy to be here and answer to all your questions today. I'm gonna pass it to Falk.
Hey everybody, my name is Falk. I'm an application engineer in Germany, and I have joined Shure in 2021. And yeah, so not that long as my both colleagues here, but in the picture you see here, we are at the ISE show in Barcelona. I can tell you it's not the best environment for RF situations here, so I'm happy if you don't have to RF coordinate something like the ISE. And we will take a look how we avoid some RF dropouts now.
Yeah, trade shows sure are fun, aren't they?
For a variety of reasons.
RF, not so much. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Okay, sorry about that. Let's so before we dig into sort of the initial information, let's take a couple of polls because we want to learn a little bit about all of you who are attending today. So first of all, we're going to talk about we want to know which wireless systems you are using. So I'm going to launch this poll right here. And we only had 6 choices, so this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but this will just give us an idea of sort of what you may be using. So are you using Axient Digital, MX Wireless, MXC Wireless, ULXD or SLXD, or some other wireless system, Shure or non-Shure? So please let us know. This will help us get a good idea of who's attending today. I can tell you I currently am using SLXD in all of my projects outside. So that is a great system. We actually just deployed it and it's fantastic. The votes are coming in. We've got a little over half voting. So let's just give it a few more minutes here, or moments, I should say. All right, I think we have about everybody we're gonna get. So I'm gonna close this poll and share some results. So it looks like the bulk of you attending are using sort of our pro mid-tier of ULXD or SLXD, and then a lot of other people are using some other system. We have a lot of Axient Digital people, a little bit of MX Wireless, and even fewer MXCW. But don't worry, we can answer questions about all of these. And so now that poll is over, we're going to launch another poll. Hide those results. All right, we want to know about where you're using these wireless. So what is your primary wireless application? Are you using wireless for live and touring sound? Are you doing more sort of presentation and conference audio? Are you working in a house of worship or education? Or are you working in a corporate audio-visual environment? So let's get an idea of where you're deploying these wireless now that we have an idea of which wireless you may be using. And the votes are slowly coming in. We're at about 40%. It's going quickly. We're above 50 now. Give it just a few more moments. Lock in those votes. Tell us, where are you using your wireless? All right, got about 75% of the vote. I think it's slowed down, so, oh, still coming in, few still coming in. All right, I think we're good. I'm gonna close the poll here, and here are our results. All right, so it looks like we have a pretty sort of even general kind of melange of different applications, mostly in the live touring sound, but a lot of house of worship, and then a little bit of presentation and conferences, and then some corporate audio visual. So thank you so much for taking the time to tell us a little bit about yourselves. Let's dive into some general best practice tips to get started.
All righty. So we thought we'd get things started by just sort of some general thoughts here about wireless microphones and why they might drop out, or just the best way to be prepared. And so as far as organizing that thought is, obviously you have to have a good successful job or event, you have to choose the correct gear in the first place. So we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into making good selections ahead of time so that you're not caught unprepared simply from the get-go and starting off on the wrong foot. Obviously, checking your gear beforehand and at the event is a good idea as well. But from the standpoint of why wireless mics drop out, you can usually narrow it down to about 2 giant buckets that fall into the sort of the general causes. We either haven't coordinated frequencies very well, and so we have problems with interference, or we have issues with the system's ability to listen/receive signals. And that could be antenna placement, could also be something compromising the transmission ability, but it's sort of, in general, antenna placement. So one of those 2 things, you're either interfered with or you don't have enough signal getting back to your receiver somehow to be able to have audio. So we thought we'd start there. As far as planning goes, I'll kick things off with, what are some of the things to consider here as you're planning? Obviously, how many wireless things are there, right? How many things do you need simultaneously? How many things already exist at the venue? What types of things, right? Is it in-ears, wireless mics? How close are these other things to you? That plays into this as well. if there's a lot of wireless, but it's, it's on a campus and it's 3 buildings away, maybe that's not as big of a deal as if it is the room next to you. That sort of idea. As far as usage, what sort of usage? Is this something that is in a space that is highly managed? Is it the Wild West of wireless, and you have to be even more careful about your choices ahead of time to make sure that you're building taking in a robust system so you can deal with the unexpected a little bit more? Is this something that's being remotely managed, so you don't have the ability to really make changes on site, so you have to be conscious of that? What sort of application is this? Is this a flexible space, multi-purpose room, training room? What sort of thing are we doing? And that might determine the wireless series that you choose, the type of spectrum that you're operating in. Some spectrum will affect the specs and audio quality of the system. Others won't as much. Form factors, that kind of gets into the transmitter type. So do you need gooseneck mics, boundary mics, as opposed to the more traditional ones we see a lot, which are handheld and body pack, lapel and headset? Because some systems don't even have that form factor. If you need a gooseneck and boundary microphone, that automatically would limit your wireless mic selection as far as the system goes. So all these sort of general planning checklist items would be a good thing to really think about before going to a place. So once you've chosen the correct system, now we get into the sort of nuts and bolts of how do we think about RF coordination and then the antenna, proper antenna deployment. And to that, I'll pass this along to Farak to discuss that.
Great, thank you. So as you mentioned, the next step is RF coordination, and it's a part of the planning of a system. So after you have to choose your right system, and the channel count, just as mentioned, we have to select the right RF frequencies, correct setup for the system. And if we know how many channels we have to use, we can go, for example, to the wireless workbench and check where in the spectrum I can place all my channels I needed. And just for design phase or in the planning, we can look in wireless workbench after some television broadcast stations and in your region or the region where the event happened, and we can sort out the correct spectrum for our applications here and be prepared of the TV broadcast traffic. Next step is in the design phase. The most systems we can choose some backup frequencies. So keep in mind that we don't have only use one frequency. We can prepare 1, 2, or maybe 3 or 4 or even more backup frequencies for every channel. And if somewhere there's a dropout, the right system, maybe it's a high-risk system, and we have to automatically change the frequency, we can do this with our system and be fine with every interference we run into. And for this, we have to scan the frequency, the system, the whole RF spectrum when commissioning the system and while we run into the show, so we can just react on every single step we run into. But in best case, we don't run into the dropouts with the correct antenna placement. It will be a major point here, and maybe we pass over to Michael.
I was going to say the scanning during the design phase versus commissioning is also key, because there's some spectrum where you can't know ahead of time what's going to be there. So there's certainly benefit to if the integrator or somebody can go ahead of time to get some scans before bringing the wireless, that's great. And then when you're there, of course, you have to do it again. So yeah, Mika.
I just want to add that that's why you can use great tools like 8600 Spectrum Manager. You can leave it at site. You can run a scan, which can take up to 72 hours, right? And you can see how spectrum has changed, for example. So you can have all those like useful informations for your coordination. But as the folks said, of course, very important part of your coordination is the scan. And we all have to remember that, for example, wireless workbench, which is a great tool for wireless coordination, for RF coordination, is kind of a calculator, right? Whenever we want to calculate for intermod, when we want to check if our frequencies are compatible with each other, the thing is that we could use pen and paper to do this. It would take a lot of time, but we have to remember that like wireless workbench will calculate for us, but we have to feed some kind of information to wireless workbench, right? So whenever we think about, okay, I have to do a scan inside, first we should be thinking about, okay, so what kind of information I'm gonna feed to wireless workbench to my system? And that's why the antenna placement is so important for the whole spiel of doing wireless. And of course, you have your usual suspects like antenna to antenna distance. So whenever you have your wireless mics or wireless transmitters and wireless receivers and their respective antennas, you have to remember that like putting them too close together can be as much harmful as putting them too far away from together, right? So that's a common, especially when you're using a lot of transmitters and you bunch them up together and they're close to their receiving antennas, they can cause tons of problem for your system. So those distances between your transmitting antennas and receiving antennas will be very important. Then you have polarization loss, which also is a huge factor because depending on how those waves, electromagnetic waves, line up, you can really lose a lot of signal. So it's also very important to remember about like the orientation, about the orientation of the antennas and different tips and tricks how we can optimize that so we can have the best results. And of course, something very common that that will happen to wireless users, no matter if you're working on stages doing live sound or corporate events, all kind of metal surfaces, LED walls, everything that when it's too close to your receiving antennas will show up in a wireless workbench, for example, as very high noise floor. And I'm sure we can show you a bunch of examples of how that noise floor can look like. And also a very important part of whole antenna placement topic is multi-zoning. So very often you have to create a coverage for multiple rooms. And there are also few rules how to do that. So your system can work really efficiently across all the rooms. And I think that would be a very brief summary of the antenna placement.
So the picture there of those three receivers stacked is what not to do. They got the angle of the antennas looks pretty appropriate, but since we have three antennas taped together, each antenna qualifies as a metal surface. So you have three parallel metal surfaces basically tied together, which will make those. I don't know about noise, but the receiving ability of those antennas, the efficiency goes down. So that's that's
like
a good.
We like to call them antenna farm.
Antenna farm, that's right, yeah.
You're not going to grow anything good in an antenna farm.
Yeah.
I know that.
Yeah.
You know, Dave, I'm going to kind of kick it off with this one question because you were talking about the angles, even though that antenna farm was incorrect, the angle was correct. And we did get kind of a question about that 90-degree orientation. The question is, many diversity receivers instruction manuals suggest setting the attached dipole antennas in a 90-degree orientation to add the benefit if polarity diversity, because of the distance spacing, is far less than what is considered optimum spacing for diversity reception. Ooh, this is a mouthful. Given remoted dipoles or LPDA antennas, does this still provide a benefit at 1 wavelength, 3 wavelengths, 7 wavelengths?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think the first thing, because we obviously have a wide variety of wireless users with different knowledge levels. So the first thing I just want to make sure is diversity is where the receiver has two antennas, an A and a B generally, that are spaced a certain distance apart to help mitigate dropouts due to signals reflecting around the room or loss in signal due to being off polarization. So there's a number of reasons why a system only looking through one antenna might drop out. As the signal fluctuates, it might fluctuate too much, and all of a sudden you get a dropout with one antenna. When you have two, and the system will either blend or select between those depending on the type of diversity you have, the idea is that you give the receiver a lot more chance to not drop out, right? It gets more choices, right? It's either going to get this signal or some combination of both, and that drastically reduces the dropout possibility from those reasons, from reflections. So the polarity, so you have to have an A and a B, and the first thing is they have to be spaced a certain amount of, the minimum spacing is about a quarter wavelength, I believe, and about 4 in UHF, about 4 inches or so. So attaching the antennas to the back of the receiver generally gets you into that kind of minimum, slightly above minimum spacing, so you get diversity benefit, but maybe not the best. So the best is about a full wavelength, or as I like to say it, usually about a rack space wide. And once you get to that distance, that's about as good as you're going to do from a diversity standpoint. Now, you can separate further. There's reasons for that, to get a better line of sight look, antenna A and B and other things. But strictly speaking, from a statistical probability standpoint of the maximizing your benefit from diversity, usually it's enough to do a rack space or 2 feet or somewhere in that vicinity for UHF. VHF, bigger wavelengths, further separation. Other systems, higher frequency, narrower wavelengths. So it's really about the wavelength of the frequency you're in. So that, I think, covered the distance. Someone said wavelengths. I think we were talking about the diversity separation. For the angling, that's the polarity issue, where if the receive antenna, especially the dipole, the thin half wave, quarter wave, the length of that antenna, that's the direction in which it's polarized. So if the antenna is like this, it's vertically polarized. It's ready for this. So perfect coupling would be the wave comes in vertical also. But every time the wave bounces off a wall, it changes polarization, some unknown. So we can't know that really. So in order to mitigate losses from polarization issues, we have antenna A and antenna B 90 degrees off, and that's going to kind of split our difference, right? We're never going to be worse than 45 degrees off angle, and so that's the rabbit ears arrangement that we have, that we saw in the sort of somewhat bad example. But this brings up a point. So how big of an issue is polarization? So I think, Nihao, you had a video that I think we could share that purely shows the effect of polarization on antennas. Maybe we can show that, Cheryl?
Yeah, maybe we can show the.
Yeah, hold on one second. Let me
we can see why this is a good thing to orient the antennas at the sort of 90 degrees off, so we can minimize this loss issue.
Right. Let me see if I can take control. There we go. All right. And we're going to pop up this video here. And away we go. Is there audio that's not coming through on this one? Oh no, this is just, okay, here we go. Let's start that again. Okay, so that was kind of showing what happens with the different sides of the polarization there with the mic in different angles. All right.
So we're muted. Nihao, was that your video that you put together, or was it?
Yeah, that was the video I put together, and actually, I just wanted to elaborate on what you have said before, especially that it is kind of important what kind of diversity your system is using, right? In this example, we had ULXD, as you could see, at least judging by the blue pilot tones, there is like some antenna switching there. So you could clearly see how this polarity came into effect whenever I turned my hand with the mic. And the thing is that you could ask if the setting I prepared for this video. So one antenna was upright and second one was laying on the desk. So you still get the same 90-degree angle. You couldn't see like rabbit ears, but that's the whole point, that when you have the difference in your polarity in terms of like transmitting antenna and receiving antenna, you can theoretically get an infinite loss of signal. So when your antennas are not matched perfectly, but rather at 45 degrees respective to your transmitting antenna, you will theoretically lose a bit of the signal, but rarely you will lose all of the signal.
Right, right. Well, we used to do a demonstration with this with a spectrum analyzer, which was a non-diversity receiver, right? Yeah. Just one antenna. And I think in a room, because obviously the signal is reflecting around, so you get some unknown polarization. We typically, with like a body pack, I would turn it and I would see the signal peak drop, usually close to, it could be as much as about 9 or 10 dB, which is significant.
Yeah. Yeah,
and that was so, one antenna. If you want to just kind of quantify, well, really, how bad of an issue is this? It's bad enough it could lead to a dropout, but yeah. Usually, again, it's one of these things we'll harp on, that none of these issues are all generally silver bullets. You know, as far as like usually with wireless, it's a combination of doing a bunch of things wrong, and so sometimes you have to, if everything's working, that's great, but sometimes when things don't work, then you have to go back to the old playbook and the checklist and start going through some of the more obvious things, and eventually you'll fix enough things where the system will be good enough. It'll have a good enough signal to noise ratio. That's really all this is about, is as much signal as I can get without, you know, clipping or having too much signal into the receiver, and a high enough above the noise floor that I don't drop out, because the signal is, we don't see it often, but it's bouncing around in signal strength as we move in the space. And so we just want to make sure we don't hit that noise floor, which I guess sort of would bring it to that graphic I got to earlier, which is examples of, you know, why you would want to coordinate frequencies, avoid these square wave looking things or digital TV stations. And if we don't plan correctly, it's essentially operating on a higher noise floor. So we're more likely to drop out due to signal fluctuations from polarization issues and from moving around, and that sort of thing.
I think that the noise floor topic is also very crucial in terms of like extending range of your wireless system, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you look at those like red bars, which are like representing your transmitters, mm-hmm. if you go further from your receiving antenna, this level will drop.
Exactly.
But as long as your noise floor is low, you should still receive a pretty decent signal, because the ratio is good, it's still good. But when you put like the most right red bar, when you put it like on top of DTV or whatever, like there's no margin for you to work with that kind of like
like the example on the right might work if you're standing within 10 feet of your receiver. You know, the one in the middle, maybe it would work fine. You wouldn't notice. If your application means that you're standing 30, 50 feet away from your receiver, you might not even know that you're on top of a weak TV station, you know, but it's there. It just means your range is going to be less and you're more likely to have problems.
I feel like this example in the middle, the red bar in the middle, could be most troublesome, because when at some point user will you know, experience dropouts, some users, the natural reaction would be, okay, I have to boost my signal. And if they can use like Xtend Digital with Showlink and remotely boost up the transmitting power, that's fine, right? But when they gonna boost the antenna, receiving antenna, the booster on the receiving antenna, then everything goes up, and like
if you
won't get the results you're expecting.
If you use gain on the receive side, everything goes up.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, that was a really great discussion. We have a lot of questions though, so we're going to have to really get into these. Okay, lots of questions about antennas, antenna placements, distro, all that great stuff. So let's kind of start with a more basic antenna question. Is there any advantage to using half wave versus quarter wave antennas? And when would you maybe use one versus the other?
Let me start. First of all, if you want to install your antennas remotely, you basically cannot use quarter wave antennas. You need that ground plane in order to that quarter wave antenna work properly. So I saw some installations where, because of lack of resources or whatever the reason was, user would put the, like, basically connect the antenna directly to the end of the coax cable. And in some instances with half-wave dipoles, this will work to some extent, of course. But with quarter waves, if you need something remote, quarter wave always will need that ground plane to work properly.
All right.
So that.
Yeah, I know some folks will ask if it's on the receiver, does it matter, quarter wave versus half wave? And in general, not really, other than, of course, you don't want them in the back of the rack. If they're appropriately on the front of the rack, line of sight, there shouldn't be too much of a performance issue. I a lot of times, if I can, will recommend people get half wave antennas, just simply because inevitably somebody decides later on down the road, hey, we need to move these antennas somewhere, and then then they have a problem. Like Nihao said, and now they've remote mounted quarter wave antennas. So it's more of a preemptive recommendation, but on the rack, on a ground plane, it shouldn't matter between quarter wave and half wave. But where it matters is to his original point. Yeah.
Great. All right, we have a couple of questions that kind of focus on sort of distro, the need for distro, and or the situation where you might not be able to use distro. So, I think the first question I have here is, with limited AV table real estate and the need to stack receivers, how should the antennas be splayed? And then sort of a related question to that I'm going to kind of present at the same time, which is, how do you solve for close spacing of antennas when installed in a rack and not able to use RF distribution?
Well, we always recommend RF distribution, and the reasons, we'll talk about the reasons before discussing how we might deal with it if we have to. But to the original point of that sort of bad example where the antennas were, that's an extreme example of taping antennas together, obviously. But if you have parallel metal things, and antennas are parallel metal things within really about 4 inches of each other, it affects the polar pattern of the antenna, which I think we have, there's a good example of a good looking toroid or donut pattern of a half wave antenna. But when you start stacking them close to each other, that will get disrupted. And so the efficiency, the reception ability of the antenna is going to go down. That's why distribution is so important for maximizing your range. Now, will it work? Again, most things will work to some extent. You just won't have as good range as you might expect. If you can't do distribution, keep that sort of spacing in mind. Do it if you have to put, separate receivers by multiple rack spaces to be able to put the antennas so they're a little bit more in free space and not closer than 4 inches apart. I think that helps. But obviously, we always have to recommend best practices. So the antenna distribution is the way to go. I don't know if you guys have some thoughts on that, or jobs you've encountered where I'm sure you have.
Of course, the picture you showed us before is the worst case scenario, because you have multiple parallel metal objects next to each other, and one might just imagine that instead of having 4 rack units with 8 antennas, you're just getting the huge, very ineffective antenna array, basically, which is not working as it's supposed to be working. And I guess we would really love to, and we would really like to be able, to recommend you guys some magic tip what to do whenever you cannot afford, or if there's not an option for an antenna distribution system. But in the real world, it's just like laws of physics. It really not that much can be done. So my recommendation would be, if you have a table, just space them next to each other instead of top of each other. It may help a little, but also, as Dave mentioned, probably to some extent, whatever you do, it will work to some extent. But when it's good, it's good. When it stops working,
I've seen people do where they have, instead of receivers next to each other, they'll alternate them in the rack, and then they have the blank rack space next to each receiver, but all opposite, left then right, then left then right, and they're on there. That spaces them a little bit more. It's not clean, but that could get you by if you needed to do that. But yeah, it's all just follow that sort of spacing rule as best you can, and you'll do okay. But yeah, distro, that's part of the planning phase ahead of when you show up to set yourself up for success, is to make sure that's thought of and taken care of, if possible, obviously.
Just one thing that came to my mind really quickly, that, for example, if you're planning for GLXD, for example, and you need, let's say, 8 channels, maybe it's worth considering GLXD, which has this antenna distribution already inside, and you can really easily connect 2 receivers. So then you, let's say, don't have to buy additional device, right?
Yeah, I think that's you gents said a couple of things that I think really ring true, which is the one thing, which is sometimes it will work, the doing what you're not supposed to do will work, so, but on the same token, it works until it doesn't, and then there's that one time where it doesn't, and then you're in trouble. So best practices are best practices for a reason. It's not to say you can't make it work, but it's also not to say you're not potentially going to run into issues. And then the other thing, is you have to take into account when, and I know it's not always ideal, if you're in the middle of a situation, but you have to take into account that full channel count when you're making that decision, and if you're going to have more than a couple of systems, distro needs to be part of that equation, and that might change what you need. So just always keep that in mind, that, the best offense is a good defense, and getting that information in from the get-go is where you're really having the best equipment, and having the best distro to start is going to avoid issues. But I know we're not all in that that happy place. So speaking of sort of a rack with multiple situations going on, and this is one that I have actually been guilty of. I'm running an IEM and a QLXD in the same rack, and I know it's not optimal. They have the IEM in the back of the rack and the QLXD in the front. The rack shields the QLXD from the IEM signal to some degree, and they're also learning that IEM antennas backwards 45 degrees and QLXD 45 degrees forward, so all 3 antennas are 90 degrees from each other. Does this make sense? Are there better options? Also thinking of using half wave for IEM, since antenna is in back, the rack in between antenna and receiver on the belt pack. Sorry, that was a lot. I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to say maybe one of the options would be to remote mount one of those pairs of antennas. Yeah. I think that is your simplest and quickest solution, and potentially maybe that IEM antenna, since it's one antenna as opposed to 2 antennas for your wireless system. So yeah,
precisely, Cheryl. That's exactly what it's easier to move one antenna than 2, so the IEM is generally best one, the likely candidate. And I think that we generally say ideal separation is going to be at least about 10 to 15 feet of the IEM antenna away from the mic antennas. If you can't do that, though, there are some tricks. I know some people have done directional antennas and put, I believe what they do is put the IEM in front of if it's directional, I think they put it in front. But maybe how Falk, you might have seen different examples of if they have to be sort of like there's a monitor land where they can't really move things too far away. They'll use the polar pattern of, some of these paddle antennas and helical antennas to benefit.
Yeah, I'd say remoting that IEM antenna would be probably the best choice. And also, if you can afford PA805, for example, which is directional antenna, that would give you a separation. But also, if those devices cannot be separated more than they are right now, what I would recommend is turning to RF coordination and trying to separate those in the spectrum available, especially if those are operating in the same spectrum. Try to, separate them as much as possible. And then also, that's maybe topic for another conversation, but also, for example, in wireless workbench using inclusion groups, if you pack them pretty tight, you will also, let's say, prevent IMD spreading all over the spectrum. So
we refer to that sometimes as band planning, right?
Yeah.
Ahead of time to see if you have your wireless mics, for example, are in the sort of high 400, low 500 megahertz. Maybe the in-ear monitors can be in the upper 5, lower 6, like the upper part of the UHF spectrum. And that general separation is going to help the receive section not be so saturated with
Exactly.
out of band energy or even near band energy. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Okay, I have a couple of questions since paddle antennas came up. I do have a couple of questions about paddle antennas. Do the paddle UA874s, do those cause dropouts at close range? And sort of, and what are some of the problems you might see with those paddle antennas at a closer range?
I have a pretty good analogy of the close range and having dropouts. So imagine being in a dark room and seeing the candlelight, right? So your eyes will adjust to the dark room, but when someone will enter the room and turn on the lights, you will be blinded for a second. And our top tier system have this gain ranging that will allow and prevent excessive amounts of power being received by the receiver. But you have to remember that dropouts are not only caused by your transmitter being too far, but also you can blind your system because all wireless systems are made to be super sensitive to be able to pick up those low level signals from far away. So yeah, for sure, you have to pay attention to how close your transmitters are to your receiving antennas, especially if you're using active receiving antennas, and what's the setting on the amplifier.
Yeah, the good news is we have on a lot of these systems, we have RF overload indicators that will kind of give you, and if those start lighting up, oh, I better either move further away from the receive antennas, or use a lower transmit power, one of the two, or perhaps I am, using too much gain. We've seen people with the paddles with maybe 10 feet of coaxial cable, and the paddle is set to plus 12 gain because they think that's going to help with the range, but all you're doing is boosting unnecessarily and maybe raising the noise floor of your receiver. So it goes back to that example of the noise floor, right? By overloading your receiver, the noise floor is just generally higher. It's a similar issue to the IEMs. If you have the IEMs too close to your receive antennas, the noise floor of that receiver goes up. It means your wireless mics are going to go down. I had one person call in, said they were doing a scan. I think this was with the old SLX system, and they scanned and the response was full. I don't know, actually, that was one. The other was just with their in-ear system. They were standing next to their in-ear system with their in-ear pack and ran a scan, and it kept finding no frequencies because they were running their scan on their receiver pack a foot away from their transmitter, and the receiver just said, I can't find anything because the receiver said it looked like the high noise floor across the board. So it's a similar idea. You can be too close, absolutely.
Okay, and is there an optimal angle to place paddle antennas in?
Yeah, 45 degrees or two of those at 90 degrees, because those are linearly polarized. Sorry for butchering the pronunciation. Yeah.
The only time you don't really angle the antennas is when you have these kinds.
Yeah,
these are
because you don't have to, right?
The helical, or they're circularly polarized. So that's a really useful antenna that sort of takes into account all polarizations, right? It doesn't matter.
Dave, jump to slide 28. We can compare all antenna types.
Oh, good idea.
Hey, there we go.
Yeah, good one. Yep.
That is a great slide. That is a great and useful slide. And I see the dipole, and I think I remember seeing a question about dipole antenna placement. Let me find that one. We've got a lot of questions.
That's fantastic.
What is the best placement if you're using a dipole antenna as opposed to the other types that we've been talking about?
On top of the rack.
There you go.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Yeah, line of sight to your transmitter at an appropriate distance.
Yeah.
Okay. Can older analog remote antennas and coax cables be used with more modern digital systems such as ULXD 4Q?
Of course.
Yeah. You don't have
So-
to get new
yeah,
cables
so-
or antenna.
Right, to a level, well, it really depends more on the frequency range, right? As long as
Yeah.
if it's a digital UHF system versus an analog UHF system, all the antenna setup can be the same, really.
Mhm.
But if it's, you know, a 2.4 gigahertz system versus digital versus UHF analog, that changes the game. So
I just want to add that if your coax cable is like 20 years old, maybe buy a new one.
yeah.
So think about replacing it, not so much for interoperability, but because it might just be time. I like that. Okay. Can you talk about what you might need to do, what you can do when you need to increase the power on an antenna? I'm guessing maybe like the gain on an antenna?
Sure.
If-
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, if we're talking about the amplifier on 874, for example, the main reason to fiddle with the setting is just to compensate for any losses caused by, for example, excessive run of the coax cable, right? Yeah, actually, yeah, calculating that. So the link budget, right? That's the important thing. So we should always stay. We should always try to keep like this unity gain, or our signal shouldn't be less than -3 dB from the antenna to the receiver, or more than 3 dBs. Sometimes it's like maybe 5 dBs is also okay. But yeah, so that's the only reason. We should never like change the setting to +12 because we need to extend the range because of the noise floor and so on.
Only enough gain to try the goal is to be at unity by the time you get back to the receiver, but within that window, you know, no more than 5, because you can amplify too much or not enough, but ±5 is what I've heard in our documentation. Yeah.
Okay. We got a couple of questions about GLXD and GLXD Plus. A pre-submitted question was, I own multiple GLXD 4 Plus mics. When my husband uses a mic, it periodically drops the signal, but when I use it, it stays strong. Could it be setting, placement of the receiver, or how he sings into it?
Well,
I don't
guess
think how he sings is going to affect
no,
it.
that's the microphones make no judgment about singing quality.
Unfortunately.
Not yet, anyway. AI doesn't exist there yet. I would say the fact that it affects one person versus the other sort of leads me to believe the receiving part of things is probably okay, right? Otherwise, you would think that being a common reception point, regardless of who's singing. So then you start looking at, okay, what's different about the users? Human beings are full of mostly salt water, big bags of salt water, and we absorb signal quite well. Especially GLXD Plus and GLXD are 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz systems, so very high frequency, very short wavelength, which means we absorb that stuff even better. So if it was the husband, right? The husband and wife? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is the husband grabbing the handheld at the bottom and covering the antenna with their hand, at which point the transmitter can't even, it's losing a ton of signal before it can even get out of the transmitter. And because it's a Wi-Fi system, perhaps the husband is wearing a device that is, broadcasting Wi-Fi, whereas the other person is not, or standing closer to a router or something of that nature. So it could be an interference thing, or it could be a body absorption. I would probably lean towards the most likely thing would be grabbing the antenna at the bottom, and then the person submitting the question is grabbing it where we want, which is more in the middle, the handle of the microphone, away from the antenna. But I don't know if you guys have other thoughts about that. But your GLXD Plus.
Really good advice for troubleshooting. Probably if wife and husband could stand in the same point in the room, right, and try to see what's being done differently, that should help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it.
We know that, you know, this sort of question affects systems like I know, Farak, you do well with MXW and MXCW. Those are systems in higher frequencies that are not TV band, but where some people will say, yeah, the mics on this side of the room drop out, or these particular people, and then you start having.
We see this kind of problem with MX wireless or even MXC wireless. So we always recommend, especially for MXC wireless, to place a APT, your antenna, not at the same height as your listeners or your attendees at the meeting. So every single person will absorb the signal. So if you place the antenna above, you will always have a clear line between transmitter and receiver, and always have a good audio.
All right. Can you expand a little bit on the effect of proximity to LED walls?
Yeah, do we have a slide? I have a noise floor. This, I don't know, I think this might have been an LED wall. This was in VHF, but could have also been lighting, but it's a similar idea. So some of these devices, and they're getting better, but depends on their age and the power section and all that. But the closer you are to them, they sort of, the power section sort of emits a broadband noise, and the receiver picks that up, especially if the antennas are mounted on or near that thing. And when you shut those things off, you would see the difference. Something akin to this, right? The green section, it's about almost a 10 dB jump, but there's some worse examples I know I've seen.
Also, that's quite funny, but RF person on site can be the best judge of how poor or cheap the LED wall was manufactured, because it will be very clear very soon on the RF scan. And also, my tip would be that if you can ask the visual department to turn on the LED wall for your test, always ask them to put the white color on, because white color is a mix of all colors, and depending on the color on the screen, you will have different readouts during RF scans. So it's always the best practice to get the white color on the screen and then do a scan.
Wow, that is so interesting.
Yeah.
I love it. That's such a great tip. Thank you, Mikhail. So what do you all recommend for using in real time to monitor the RF quality of your units?
We obviously, being Shure, have a number of networked receivers that can be used. Network them with standard networking equipment and use our free wireless workbench. We're on 7 now. 6 is still available depending on what you're using and familiar with. But this scan that you see up here was done with that wireless workbench software. So you're able to scan within a receiver's frequency band, its window. Even better than that would be, I think Nihao mentioned this earlier, but we have a so-called spectrum manager. The new one's fantastic, and basically a real-time analyzer that can analyze multiple bands. And that's a wideband thing. It can look at VHF, it can look at UHF, it can look at, I believe, all the way up to, I think it can look at
2.0.
Yeah, 2.0, yeah. So all the systems that would be using somewhat static scans, predictable scans like that, UHF and close to it, would be useful for that. And that's a good way of getting a snapshot of the space and then coordinating, I suppose.
And also, since it's a real-time spectrum manager, I was able to even pick up the spikes in decked band with 8600. So it's really a versatile device to scan everything from VHF to 2.0.
Yeah, it's a little pricey, but for what it does, it's actually a pretty affordable box. So if that's out of realm, there are other handheld scanners. I know RF Explorer is a popular one, I believe, which can export a text file, comma separated text file, which you can then import into Workbench to see a scan. There's some other portable, less expensive. TTI, I think, makes one that's pretty good. So there's those options, and then, but if you're in other spectrum, I'll note that only really applies to, we've been kind of UHF focused here, so I'll pull up some other systems. I'll let Falk kind of discuss the MXW, the ones that are in the higher frequencies. It's a little less predictable, so the tools vary a bit. So this would be how you'd plan in that space.
Yeah, for MXW, we can use a frequency scanner built into the software MX wireless to see, such as pictures here shown, with not good results, better or best results, or you use a 8600 and you can see the little hikes for the DECT system. But we use this tool here for analyze the DECT spectrum in our environment when we do an MXW installation, and troubleshoot the problems.
Yeah, and the nature of that spectrum, you want to run longer scans as possible, right? Just to be able to capture things hopping around.
Everything, exactly, because we with the DECT system we use what's the name? It's gone.
UPCS.
Yeah. Where it is?
What are you trying to refer to?
For the time slot system, time slots.
TDMA. Yes.
Yes, so we always have to scan it for a longer time, so we see all for a longer time the hops and time slots.
Yeah.
Where the frequencies uses.
So that's that one. The MXCW can analyze. It's a lot of these systems are sort of in charge of analyzing their own.
Yeah. So for MXC wireless, we can use any Wi-Fi sniffer as well to troubleshoot in our environment the MX the wireless spectrum here, so we can see which Wi-Fi channel is available and which is not. So we can maybe do a little bit of choosing. Okay, our MXCW system will use 64 to maybe 124, and the free Wi-Fi internet access can use 44, 161, and some of the other channels. So we can separate the systems using Wi-Fi, just like the case with the in-ear monitoring and microphone receivers in one case, one rack. Just separate the usage of this spectrum as far as possible.
Any last burning questions, Cheryl?
Well, I was just going to say I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that we are pretty much out of time and we have a ton of questions. But I have really good news for everybody that has questions, especially questions. We had a lot of questions specific to people's applications and how they were using wireless in their own specific issues that they're running into. And the good news is that these gentlemen, along with a lot of other very knowledgeable people, are available to help you with all sorts of troubleshooting and all sorts of questions. And that is what they are paid to do, my friends, and they do it well. So how do you reach these people? It's very easy. You can go to shure.com/contact, and there you can either fill out a form to open up a ticket with the team, or there's phone numbers there as well. And you can find phone numbers for your local application support team by going to shure.com in your region. So lots of great people. They are just priceless, and I think there's something that set our company apart from so many others. So thank you all for joining us, especially to our three very knowledgeable panelists today. I hope you learned a little something, and I hope if you can bring any more questions to them, just reach out. And we hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.